This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning, everybody. You're listening to Money Matters on KPFT Houston. The time is now 11 a.m. is what I'm so used to saying every Friday morning at 11 a.m. However, we are still in lockdown and quarantine here, and so we are broadcasting live from the extra bedroom in my house. And we are doing, in addition to the podcast version and the live radio show, we're doing a video version as well. And this is really focused around COVID-19 and a response to that. So our guest today is Sarah Nadav. She's a behavioral economist specializing in decision making during a financial crisis. A couple articles that she had posted recently that I thought were really well done as far as looking at some of the solutions and just kind of brainstorming and thinking of things that we might do to respond to COVID-19. So we'll do kind of a deep dive on that. If you are a longtime listener, you know we always reserve just the first few minutes of the show to tell you a little bit about what's going on in the Houston and the Gulf Coast area when it comes to financial literacy. Right now, Houston Money Week, which you've heard me talk about since last year, the fourth quarter of last year, we were building up, building up, building up, and April was Financial Literacy Month. So we've pretty much hit pause on that. Some of our nonprofit partners, the Women's Community Center here in Houston, Women's Resource Center, has been doing financial literacy talks virtually, and so that's one of the things we'll share with you as we move forward. But pretty much everything else has kind of been put on pause for now. We have our 100 Teens event that takes place in the local Houston Fed, but that also has been put on pause. So we're not done. We're just putting it on pause for this first quarter. Most of the free and events that we have for financial education are held out in the public, so they're large groups. So we're having to get creative as far as how do we get these free events out to people. But stay tuned. We will keep at this, and we'll let you know as it changes. With that, Sarah has been waiting very, very patiently. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So now I did share that you're a behavioral economist, and you've got a couple different articles that kind of got on my radar here. But can you share something about yourself outside of the bio that I've just mentioned with listeners so that we can get to know you a little bit better?
Sure. Well, I started out learning about human behavior because I was interested in how to bring positive change, how to help people make good choices, not necessarily about money. Um, Post 2008, I created a startup to help people in debt try with and that was the beginning of the kind of merging of the behavioral sciences and the economics, and that transformed into a career of behavioral economics, where I spent 10 years with a very deep dive on people going through step by step, from the moment it hit, or sometimes trying to come in a few years later and help them pull themselves out of a bad situation.
So that sounds like something that would be really handy right about now as we're going through this pandemic that we didn't really plan for. COVID-19, we've planned for things that we want to recover from, but this is one of those things that people, I would say, didn't necessarily have on their radar there. One of the articles that you published, high stakes poker and the zero sum game. I like that. Could you tell us a little bit about that and what your thinking was on that?
Yeah, sure. So part of behavioral economics is understanding things like game theory, how people make their decisions, and why. Now, there's lots of different strategies that you can take in a given situation. There's a win-win strategy where you come to a negotiated compromise, and two sides can walk out. And there's a zero-sum game. And the zero-sum game is anytime when you're in a situation where there's one clear winner and one clear loser. And that's why poker, it's a zero sum game. You win. If somebody's going to win chips, they're going to walk away with the table with your chips.
Right, right.
There's no way to win without you losing, is the zero sum game. I thought about it in terms of COVID-19 because there's been a lot of debate where people have tried to pit the economy against health, to say this is a trade-off we need to make. And the point I was trying to make is that actually COVID-19 is a zero-sum game situation where you get a good, healthy economy and a healthy population, or you get an out of control virus. And that those have to be seen in these kind of dichotomies, not negotiated win-win situations.
I love that. What stood out about that is that I just even the discussion of solutions is like a nonpartisan approach. I think the way that we will get through this is by kind of stepping back and looking at it. So I like that. That really made a lot of sense there. You also had another article, one called "How a Financial Freeze Could Protect Us from Economic Collapse." Could you tell us about that as well?
Yeah, that's something that I'm very passionate about in terms of working towards a solution. And that also pulls back on my experience of working with people in financial crisis. There's only one predictor of people who will go into debt. Uh, and there's been a lot of research looking at, is it people who overspend or have impulse control? Is it people who want to compete with their neighbors or the Joneses? And actually the only consistent predictor of someone who will go into debt is someone who has a family and their income goes below their fixed expenses, meaning their rent, their car payments, their existing expenses, which they can't do anything about and they can't lower. There's as frugal as you want to be, and then there's the bottom line. Anytime the income goes below that amount, people go into debt, and it starts a crisis.
So I know working with people, but doing budget counseling, and before I was a financial advisor, I did consumer credit counselors or consumer credit counselor Southwest, and I dealt with a lot of people on credit card budgeting. And there's only a few things that you can do when the expenses are more than the income. And so you said that's kind of the triggering event for the debt. That's what starts them in that direction.
That's a triggering event for the debt, and but on a larger scale, people don't actually realize how much flexibility we have with banks and institutions. So the idea is, if you freeze fixed expenses, then you can actually make a really large impression, I suppose, or a reduction in the pressure on an individual, and a reduction on the pressure for government support. Government does not have an unlimited amount of money to continue pouring to individuals or to companies or to small businesses for a long term, especially when we're talking with people in a very wide range of socioeconomic needs. Some people are starting out with a high mortgage and high car payments because they had a high income and that made sense. Some people are starting out on a very subsistence level, and they need much less money. Regardless, the government is not going to be able to cover everybody's needs at every level. They can provide a universal basic income and calculate how much do people need for food, how much do they need for medicine, how much do they need for essentials. And the government is pretty much equipped to supply that for quite a long time, without creating a significant deficit or more of a deficit than we have right now. And the banks are more flexible than you would think. When you pay your mortgage or your car payments or your loans, that's their revenue. And they use that money to go on and further lend. The government could support them to essentially put a pause on collecting those payments without interest and tax, and support the businesses, support the lenders so that they don't collapse. Because also, to be very blunt about it, the alternative is that people stop paying and you see mass foreclosures, which is a cascading series of events that's not good for the banks either. So there are people who will say, "Oh, this fixed expense freeze isn't it? You know, it's wild, it's crazy. It's actually sensible and could be implemented fairly quickly."
So I'm just smiling as you say that, because if we had this conversation in January, then yes, people would have said, "What are you talking about? This is crazy." But we also would not have foreseen the Fed dumping trillions of dollars into corporate bonds. And this morning, I think they dropped money into corporate bond ETFs, which is a first. And so we have these things that are happening. You mentioned, when we framed this in the past, when you mentioned some of your influences came out of 2008, 2009, we can kind of look back and see what's worked in the past coming out of an economic recession. And so the discussion that we're having now, I think people are more open to listening uh,
Yeah.
and and thinking about these solutions. So that one's very interesting. One of the things you mentioned is that the freezing the expenses, having the banks put off on collecting these debts at this point, and the idea that if people are still able to pay those expenses, then the banks are still able to keep their doors open. And we've supported the banks in the past through, the last time this happened, 2008, 2009, that was one of the shifts where we came in and put money into the banks. And what happens typically is they'll not lend if everything just kind of goes to a pause. So tying this into your zero sum game, I can see where they're connected here. So let's also talk about one of the things you mentioned, or one of the things you've written about is lockdowns exist to combat uncertainty, not COVID-19. What does that mean? Tell us about that.
Well, COVID-19 is very new. And for as long as the weeks or months that we've been dealing with it, we are daily discovering new parts of the body that it attacks. We're discovering the long-term effects. We know when people would say, "Oh, well, it's just killing old people," it's like, actually, no, we know that it kills old people first. We don't we don't know what happens in a few months, um, and we don't know how to deal with it. So the lockdowns are essentially a way to say, give us some time to come up with the treatment, give us some time to find out how this spreads, give us some time to find out which businesses are safe to be open, which businesses are not safe to be open, if this really is dangerous only for the elderly, or if this is, as they're finding, young people are now getting strokes. Um, Children are having blood diseases. It's the So the uncertainty is the time that we need to protect the general public while scientists and doctors figure out really what this is and what we're up against.
So I like the way that you frame that, because right in the title. You're saying it's not a cure, and that's not what it's intended to be. It's intended to buy us time, and it's good to have a reminder of that as the next 3 months roll out, and we see what unfolds in front of us. Time is really one of the only things that we just putting that extra amount of time to step back and use some critical thinking skills to come up with some solutions. That's one of the only leverage points we have here. So I
Yeah.
think that's huge. One of the other things I wanted to ask you about is there's an art now. Specifically, you wrote an article called "Heads Up: Marketing and Sales Teams Are the First on the Chopping Block." Now I know there's a
Yeah.
lot of people that just lost their jobs. Uh, Historically, we haven't recorded unemployment numbers in the Great Depression, but after that, this is the largest one on record right now. And
Yeah.
so, what do you want to tell those people who are in marketing and sales when it comes to this?
What I'd like to tell them is actually to focus on their communities and local businesses. A lot of people with world-class marketing skills are being cut from some of the biggest players, Google and major tech companies, and major brands are cutting their sales and marketing teams. I believe that the best thing possible um, for economic sustainability is to refocus on local and keeping local businesses alive and helping them get online and helping them continue to provide their services. So my message really is for sales and marketing teams is to look at your community, look what you can do for the businesses around you so that you can help them continue to have revenue, and then that will, be a virtuous cycle.
So I love that because the small business owner, the entrepreneur, those are the ones that are getting hurt a lot right now. And
Yes.
the idea of keeping it local is not a bad idea in general. But specifically when we're going through these economic downturns, that's huge to keep that on the radar and remember that. If you're just joining us and you're listening, we're talking with Sarah Nadav, and Sarah has set up a website called Now let me say this because it's a long title here. rapidconcovid19.com. So it's the word
It's
rapid and then
econ like economy. So
okay.
rapid econ COVID-19.
So I love that. So it's rapid econ like economy COVID-19.com. So if you want to find out more about what she has done, because it sounds like you've put a lot of different resources. In fact, tell us a little bit about the website.
Well, the website, I've got a wide network of entrepreneurs, futurists, technologists, investors, philanthropists, marketers, um, people who are working on every level of tech and finance. And I opened up my network, and I have like 30,000 followers on LinkedIn, and I went all out, and I was like, join in, sign up. Here's a Google form, super simple. Let's get together. Let's speak weekly. Let's write white papers. Let's come up with ideas. Let's take a departure.
I think we lost your signal there for a second.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Okay, I
Yeah,
think you're back.
we're back. Okay, where'd we leave off?
I had just, or you were talking about your network and putting that together, and then the response that you've gotten about writing white papers and that sort of thing. I think that's right where we.
So yeah, I got a whole bunch of the most interesting people I could find together, and I said, let's come up with new and different ideas. We have new and different technology. We build a lot or base a lot of our ideas on economic theories that were created 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 50 years ago, and we've just been motivating so quickly. Technology has brought us forward so quickly that let's take a departure. Let's put anything that is expected or traditional to the side, and let's try to come up with something wild and crazy and different and possible.
I love it. I love it. Well, let me before we end here, let me ask you just one question here. We're doing kind of a two-part series, so I would say this was our response to COVID-19. Eventually, we're going to do one called "Digging Ourselves Out of the Recession" when we get to it. Do you have any tips for people when it comes to digging yourself out of the recession that you might share with listeners?
I have one tip that everybody, I believe, should hear, which is to right now start viewing this as a hero's journey, and this is day one. You are confronted with a massive challenge that is not going to go away anytime soon. You should be planning for the next 2 years on how you're going to manage, and that the choices that you make right now are going to dramatically affect you in the next few months. So I highly recommend two things. One is extreme downsizing as quickly as possible. And the other is connecting with neighbors, communities, friends, and collectively working together to come up with solutions and to pressure local governments and the larger governments to answer important needs of people and not of corporations.
I love that. I love that. Those two very specific tips of say downsizing locally here within even your house, cleaning that kind of stuff that
This
count.
is like move in with your parents if you have to. This is like get a trailer if that's what you need to do because you have enough money in the bank to afford that with no income for 2 years. I'm not talking small or easy solutions. I'm saying look at your money you have in the bank. How far would it go? How high is your mortgage? Because to circle back to the fixed expenses, your fixed expenses are what's going to kill you.
Right. I love
So
it. I love it. Very specific actionable items for people right now. When I go out and I talk about financial literacy, we use that stat that Americans or individuals in general are just one event away from being bankrupt when their paychecks turned off. So a lot of times people hear that it's theory or oh we're beating up on them, but this is where we're actually seeing that kind of play out real time right now. So what you just shared with us, I think, are very very good things for people to listen to. With that, we're just right here at the end. Is there anything that I haven't asked you that you'd like to leave listeners with today?
um, there's one thing I'd like to leave listeners with, which is beyond the upcoming year or two, which is going to be incredibly hard. There's a future after that. The epidemic, the flu 1918, went right into the Roaring Twenties. The plague of medieval times led to the Renaissance. There is a lot of really positive and beautiful things coming in this world, and it's just like if you need to hunker down and get through now, deal with that, and then try to prepare and live in the expectation of better things to come.
I love it. I love it. What a good way to end the show today. Thank you so much, Sarah. Have a great rest of the day there, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.